All right, what's going on, everyone? Got an interesting article here that I thought was worth running through that was just put out by Mick Ryan, who is a retired Australian Major General and has really become one of the more prominent commentators on the war in Ukraine, kind of helping people understand how it's going, what the West has done or should be doing in order to see Ukraine succeed in the long term. Now, this article, and the reason I called this one out, and there's some parts I agree with, others that I don't, and I'll get into that, is titled How Ukraine Can Win a Long War. And I like this piece because it's a little bigger picture than just what's happening in Ukraine right now. And, if Ukraine takes this village, then eventually XYZ happens. Ryan does a good job of stepping back and talking about, no matter how the next few weeks and months play out, these are some things the U.S., the West, NATO needs to consider if we want Ukraine to be successful long-term in this war. So he starts out by kind of setting the stage as to where things sit today, saying the offensive has been, as Ukrainian President Zelensky described, a slow affair, but to many observers, ones used to instant gratification or who want a major resolution before the 2024 U.S. election, the deliberate, steady pace of the Ukrainians can be difficult to appreciate. Some U.S. security officials and policymakers have even suggested that the lack of rapid progress means the counteroffensive will not succeed. And, to be fair, I can kind of see both sides of this, right? If you're There's one aspect where you say if this is as fast as Ukraine can move in this counteroffensive, how are they going to actually sever the Russian lines? How are they ever going to make it to the Sea of Azov? How are they ever going to remove Russia from the occupied territories? And from my perspective, the answer is it's going to take years, probably. This isn't something that's going to happen over the next few days, weeks, or months, even if there's some sort of major breakthrough in the lines. There's just the density of the Russian defensive positions and the minefields, that's just not something that can be handled very, very quickly. It's going to take time. And Ryan gets into some historical examples there, saying that 18 months, where we sit today, into World War I, the Allies had lost the campaign for Turkey's eastern peninsula, and the Battle of Verdun was still underway. And after the first 18 months of World War II, most of Europe was still occupied by the Nazis. Singapore had fallen to Japan, and the United States was fighting on the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines. One of the things he says later on is how every time a war starts, people think that it's going to be quick, and that's almost always the case. Nobody starts a war and says, we're going to get into this thing, and hopefully, we can wrap it up inside of 10 years. Everybody always thinks it's going to end up wrapping up a lot sooner than it actually does. So pointing out where historical conflicts have been at the 18-month mark, I think it's useful here, right? We're right potentially in the beginning. You might in 10, 15 years look back on this, and this period right now, September 2023, could still be considered the opening days, the opening phase of the war in Ukraine. He goes on to say, Kyiv faces many challenges before the entire country can be liberated. Perhaps the greatest one is that the West, although it has provided substantial support, lacks a coherent Ukraine strategy. I 100% agree with that. I don't think that there has been a very clear-cut, easily understood strategy as to what the United States, NATO, or the West in general is doing in Ukraine. Multiple times the leaders have said things like, we're with Ukraine to the end, and we're here for Ukrainian freedom. I don't think that it has resonated, maybe is the way to put it. I mean, here in the United States, even some of the more optimistic polls in Ukraine's favor, it's in like the 60-40 range, I'd say is probably pretty accurate. 60% say continue to support Ukraine, whatever it takes, short of sending troops. And there's no poll out there that in the U.S. where people approve of sending U.S. troops to Ukraine. But even the 60-40 split, to me, that means that whatever the strategy is for Ukraine, there's 40% of the American public on or about that doesn't support what we're doing. So is it that they don't know the strategy? Is it they don't know the long-term goal? Or is it that it hasn't been articulated clearly? It's one of those, or they just don't agree with it, right? Either way, personal opinion, I don't think the long-term big-picture strategy for Ukraine has been very clearly articulated. Now, Ryan does have an idea of what that could be. He says, to that end, the United States and NATO need to make clear that their explicit goal is for Ukraine to defeat Russia's forces in Ukraine and to silence Russia's global narrative. I don't know that I fully understand. There's a couple of his points here. I'm not sure that I know exactly what he's getting at. Pretty clear cut, defeat Russia's forces in Ukraine. Okay, I think most people would understand what that means. To silence Russia's global narrative is a little more vague. That could mean a lot of things, right? And that's part of what I'm getting at when I say I don't know that we have a very clear strategy moving forward. I have heard people, nobody really notable, but you'll see occasionally online people will say things like the end of Russia. We need to end Russia, and that is a major ask, right? Like that's not going to happen likely without the involvement of NATO troops. That's the no major nuclear armed country is just going to dissolve. Like what comes next, right? So when I hear that kind of thing thrown out there, it makes me think that the strategy leading up to this stuff isn't as coherent and well-defined as it possibly could be. Ryan continues saying the challenges created by Russian defenses have received insufficient attention by Ukraine supporters. These obstacles should not have been overlooked. The perils of minefields are well known in Western military doctrine. NATO states ought to have provided Ukraine with more mechanized breaching and mine-clearing equipment. Their failure to do so is indicative of the intellectual shortfalls that infect many Western military institutions. I think he's spot on. Another analyst, Michael Kaufman, for months now, has been talking about the need for more demining and breaching equipment in the Ukrainian military. And it's kind of hard to understand why that wasn't put at the top of the list. I don't know, Bradleys and Abrams and F-16s and everything gets all the attention. But you have to have those breaching vehicles to actually engineering equipment to actually clear the lanes for those to go through, or they're just going to get destroyed by anti-tank mines. And that's partially what we've seen happen during some of these mechanized assaults. So, it's a good thing for Ryan to be calling that out. He adds that despite these challenges, the Ukrainians have adapted in one of their institutional strengths and adopted a gradual bite and hold strategy in the south, minimizing casualties while also gradually increasing the pressure on Russian defenses. I have heard a lot of this bite and hold strategy in the south, which the idea is instead of a major thrust and push through the Russian lines and kind of exploiting the breakthrough, it's more taking a little bit of territory, reinforcing that and holding it and pushing forward. But I don't know that that's necessarily proven successful quite yet. And what I mean by that is there have been kind of localized Russian counterattacks in the south, but nothing substantial. Like Russia hasn't kicked off any sort of counteroffensive of their own in the south quite yet. So the bite and hold might be just what we're seeing play out. It might not necessarily be a successful strategy long term, just something to keep in mind. Ryan continues, it's difficult to objectively measure Ukraine's progress because only a few of the most senior Ukrainian military and civilian leaders know the actual strategic and operational objectives for the country's offensives. Still to this day, you will hear people argue about success or failure of the counteroffensive, but we don't actually know what the goal is, right? I mean, I think a lot of people predicted that the goal was to expel the Russian military, and I know big picture that's going to be the goal for Ukraine to do, but was that their goal in June, July, August? There's a lot of smaller things that need to happen before that really big picture goal plays out. So I'm glad he called that out, but he says, but for outsiders viewing the war, the country's progress might be measured in ground taken, Russian forces destroyed, progress toward placing Russian forces in Crimea at peril, and the extent to which Ukraine has persuaded Western governments it is succeeding. After 2 months, it might be stated that each of these goals is in progress. And I would agree. Everything that he mentioned is likely in progress. Ukraine has retaken more territory than Russia has over the last few months. Now, Russia has been on some kind of offensives up in the east, but really when you look at the changing hands of territory, Ukraine is coming out on the positive side over the last few months. Attrition is a big question. Ryan here says that Russian forces destroyed. That metric is in progress. I think it's fair to say it's in progress. I don't think we have a good picture as to the balance there. Which side is losing more as this battle has kind of shifted into an attritional phase. He adds, over the last 18 months, the Ukrainians have blended NATO and Soviet-era weapons and doctrine. In doing so, the Ukrainians have developed their own distinct approach to modern war. I thought this was an interesting point because there's been a lot of criticism recently of Western training methods and NATO methodology and NATO doctrine and how we would fight this war, saying that it doesn't apply. And some criticism of coming from inside of Ukraine, saying, hey, we're going to these NATO training grounds being trained by people who haven't fought a war the way that we are fighting this war right now. And it's true. The sergeants and the NCOs and the soldiers, even the officers in NATO, don't have the combat experience in this type of war that the Ukrainian soldiers do. So in a sense, there's a little bit of how are we training them to fight this war? I would default to say it's not necessarily training them on the specific tactics for this war, but more on big picture things, marksmanship, medical, logistics, things like that are still necessary no matter how the tactics play out in a modern war. But it's interesting here, right? There's not really anybody else at this scale that has done this blended NATO and Soviet era weapons and doctrine in an active war. And it's definitely something we're going to have to pay attention to. Now, Ryan says both the Ukrainians and the Russians possess the resources and the will for an extended war, which, depending who you listen to, you've probably heard that Russia's on the verge of collapse for over a year now, and you've probably heard that Ukraine is on the verge of collapse for over a year now. When you get to some of the extreme ends of both, with commentators kind of on both sides, you tend to hear that, right? The opposing side is on the verge of collapse any day now. That was 16 months ago or whatever it is. So it's interesting. I do think the Russian resources and will for an extended war is of a different flavor, if you will, right? It's almost entirely domestic. There are some talks about Russia trying to procure weapons from North Korea at some point, and there's kind of some under-the-table Chinese stuff going on there. Not necessarily military equipment, but a civilian-type equipment that can be used in a military way. But then on the Ukrainian side, the vast majority is external. It's international support, right? So it's very different in terms of resources, not in terms of the will to fight. I would argue that the Ukrainians probably have a larger will to fight than a lot of their supporters in the West right now. So Ryan continues, the West must therefore accept that this will be a long war. 100% agree. Many generations have flirted with the notion that wars between large, populous, and technologically savvy states can be short. And each time that began, for example, analysts argued that World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Iraq War would be brief, only to be proved incorrect. And the same will be true of today's conflict. This is also something where I'm sure it's probably politically not a good move to say we're going to be involved in any way, shape, or form with a long war. But, God, I hate those examples going back through history of the one that comes to mind for me is how many times commanders have told their troops we're going to be home by Christmas. Right? You hear about that in the first year of World War I, or be home by Christmas. In Vietnam, too. I think it was the 173rd Airborne was activated or was moved into Vietnam when the troop presence was kind of increasing. And the brigade commander famously said something like, we're going to go over there, we're going to take care of the Viet Cong and be home for Christmas. And that was like 1965, right? 10 years later, the U.S. actually leaves Vietnam. So I do think there's some value in pushing it out longer, making the argument that this is a 10-year war, right? And if it wraps up sooner, great, but at least prepare the populations that are going to be involved in this in any way, shape, or form. Ryan continues, the United States may need to accept that its doctrine for highly complex air-land warfare is not fully suited to Ukraine. This fact does not mean that combined arms warfare is not effective, but NATO needs to lead a rapid reevaluation of its doctrine now to develop the tactics and doctrine of combined arms on a shoestring. I disagree with Ryan, if I understand him correctly here. I don't know that the focus, one of the major strengths of the U.S. military is our air power and what we can provide through our Air Force and the coordination of that Air Force with our Navy, with our Army, with our Marine Corps, land forces. I don't know that, other countries not being able to do that against a modern adversary means that we should be looking at that any differently. I think it is still our strength. I think if it was the United States manning the front in Ukraine right now against Russia, it would be a very different war. It'd be I think it would still be a contested airspace, but I don't think we'd be saying that the U.S., air-land warfare is not suited to this war. It'd be playing out a little bit differently. One of the other things I don't like with this is the idea that we should reevaluate our tactics based off of the capabilities, equipment sets of other nations. This whole, what we're doing right now in Ukraine is really not standard. We do have special forces and intelligence assets all around the world at all times that are advising military forces or militia forces, but nothing. I don't know that we've done anything to this degree, certainly in my lifetime, where the U.S. military complex, right, from DOD to the intelligence to everything, to the supply, is so heavily involved with supporting another nation at war. And anyways, my takeaway from this is that the U.S. should not relook how we would conduct this type of war. Maybe we should think about how we would support another nation if they get into a fight like Ukraine is. But I don't think that means that, the way that the U.S. would fight a war with Russia in the future is necessarily, being proven wrong right now. Ryan says, and I really like this idea. He says, a New Age Manhattan Project designed to discover new ways to rapidly detect and clear mines would help Ukrainian offensives down the line. It would also assist in clearing mines and unexploded ordnance from vast swaths of liberated Ukrainian territory. Look, the mine clearing is an interesting thing. It is, there's the problem hasn't really changed in decades, right? There's still mines all around the world. Ukraine right now is arguably the most mined territory in the entire world. It's going to be, and that's not going to randomly change in the next few weeks or months. So I like the idea of some major Manhattan project, right? That was the one that came up with the atomic bomb, this secretive project that was really pushing the limits when it came to what we understood about technology. It'd be cool to see that push towards something like clearing landmines, not just because it could be used in a military capacity, but could, think about the number of civilian lives that could be saved after a war. So I like that. We get the mine clearing Manhattan Project underway. Well, I think the first person to call probably is Ryan Hendrickson, tip of the spear, right? Get his intake, get his input, pull his team in. Let's get that thing going. Ryan continues, the menagerie of armored vehicles and the artillery provided to Ukraine has been generous, but it is not sustainable. There's a reason why armies generally have one type of tank or one kind of artillery for each need. The training and logistical burden of holding multiple types of similar systems would be large for a peacetime military. It will become unbearable for Ukraine over time. A more strategic approach to support Ukraine would provide standardized equipment sets for the country's army. This has been an interesting one as well as this whole, shipping aid and equipment to Ukraine has played out. I've seen people get really upset about the idea of saying, hey, we can't just send everything because it becomes so hard to maintain. And it's the idea of an armored company having 6 different types of vehicles from 6 different countries is crazy. Like, look, these military vehicles are complex at baseline. They're not as simple as just, an old Ford F-150 pickup truck or something. They've got these unique parts, and that doesn't mean it's a good thing. It's probably a problem, big picture, how specialized a lot of this stuff is. But when you start layering those on top of one another, it is not sustainable. So I think it's good that he called it out. It's not going to work for 5, 10, 20 years. In the short term, sure, it bridges the gap. Got it. But long term, not a viable solution for Ukraine. Wrapping up, Ryan says offering Kyiv enduring support may not be welcome news to many Western politicians, given the upcoming elections in the United States and some European countries, but the way to help Ukrainians continue their evolution in quality and endurance is making sure they know the West is prepared to support them in their fight to defeat Russia and to offer this support in 2024 and beyond. I think Ryan's spot on here. Depending on what the people say, we do have elections coming up here in the United States before too long. If we elect somebody that wants to and represents a desire to continue supporting Ukraine in any way, shape, or form, I think we got to get past this, hoping a budget gets passed so we can, send some of the ammunition that we've manufactured over the last few months to Ukraine for them to use like the next day, or some new package to Ukraine is coming out in the next few months and they don't know what's in it. We don't know what's in it. It's just a hodgepodge of something long term, right? Recognize that this war isn't going to be over in 2024, probably, right? It's probably going to last long beyond that. So let's start putting out plans, realistic plans as to how we're going to support Ukraine, if that is, again, what the people and the elected officials decide to do for 2025, 26, 27, and so on. But that's all I got for now. Again, I will link the article in the description below so you can read the whole thing if interested. I just called out a couple parts here. And then a link to where you can find Mick Ryan online. And of course, if interested in national security subjects, don't forget to check out the national security sit reps I put out on Substack. That link is also below. But thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.